In the glittering halls of Versailles, where chandeliers threw golden light on marble floors and whispers could change the course of kingdoms, true power did not always rest with the king. Behind the curtains of ceremony and the mask of absolute monarchy, there were figures who shaped decisions in ways both subtle and profound. They were not generals, nor ministers, nor crowned queens. They were the women history often reduced to a single word, mistresses. But to call them that is to miss the point. These women were information brokers, patrons of art and philosophy, and architects of alliances. They bent the ear of kings, directed the flow of favor at court, and influenced treaties that reshaped Europe. Diane de Poitiers steadied a young monarch and guided him with the wisdom of her years. Madame de Pompadour championed Enlightenment ideas while steering foreign policy, blending art and diplomacy with a deft hand. Madame du Barry, dismissed as frivolous, became a mediator in a court teeming with rivalries, only to face the ultimate price when revolution swept away the old order. Their stories are tales of ambition, brilliance, danger, and survival. They lived in a world where one misstep could mean ruin, yet they carved out space for themselves in the center of French power. To follow their lives is to step into a realm of opulence and intrigue, where the bedchamber could become as decisive as the battlefield, and where influence was often exercised in whispers rather than proclamations. Welcome to Words of Time. In this video, we will uncover the hidden influence of these uncrowned queens, separating myth from reality and exploring how their actions shaped the course of French history in ways often overlooked. The story of women in the French court who were long reduced to the label of mistress is far more complex and politically charged than it may first appear. For centuries, historians and popular culture alike have been guilty of framing these women in narrow terms, as though their only significance was in the intimacy they shared with kings. This simplification overlooks the reality that these women were political actors in their own right, often exerting influence that extended well beyond the bedchamber. Their roles deserve re-examination, not as curiosities of royal scandal, but as central figures in the machinery of monarchy, diplomacy, and the shaping of culture. When one considers the French court, it is easy to imagine glittering balls, gilded chambers, and velvet-draped salons, but beneath that surface of splendor was a world driven by power, ambition, and survival. The king may have been the visible center of authority, yet those around him shaped decisions and determined outcomes. Mistresses, often dismissed as mere ornaments of pleasure, were instead among the most skilled and strategic figures in this landscape. Their intimacy with the monarch granted them a position of proximity, but proximity alone was not enough to make an impact. What made them truly powerful was their ability to read the political climate, to form alliances, and to manipulate favor in a court where survival hinged on constant negotiation. The question of how women without official titles or constitutional authority could wield such influence is central to this discussion. The monarchy of France, particularly from the 16th to the 18th century, was both an institution of divine right and a theater of spectacle. Kings embodied absolute rule in theory, but in practice they were surrounded by courtiers, advisors, and factions competing for influence. The monarch's mistress, often derided as a personal indulgence, could become a channel through which petitions were passed, careers advanced, and policies shaped. This influence was not accidental. Women in these positions knew that the gaze of the court was on them, and they learned to convert intimacy into leverage, ensuring their voices mattered in decisions of war, diplomacy, finance, and culture. It is important to note that these women were not passive beneficiaries of fortune. Many came from families with ambitions of their own, and their presence at court was part of broader strategies of social advancement. Others rose from comparatively modest origins, relying on intelligence, wit, and determination to secure a foothold in the competitive environment of Versailles or earlier palaces. Once established, they had to balance their personal relationship with the king against the political demands of factions within the court. One wrong step could lead to ruin, for every favorite was a target of envy and hostility. Their survival required more than charm. It demanded political acuity. The French court itself was a stage set with dazzling opulence, but underscored by ruthless competition. The gilded halls of Versailles, the polished etiquette of receptions, and the endless rituals of rank masked a world where every gesture carried meaning. Who dined where, who was admitted to which chamber, who spoke first. All these small details signaled power and privilege. To succeed in this environment required a precise reading of symbols and hierarchies. Mistresses, in their ambiguous role straddling the personal and the political, often mastered this art better than anyone. They became mediators, patrons, and even policymakers, guiding royal decisions in ways that could alter the course of the kingdom. Take, for example, the famous figures who became inseparable from the reigns of French kings. Diane de Poitiers, companion to Henry II, was more than a romantic partner. She was a skilled political counselor and patron of the arts, shaping not only the king's decisions but also the culture of the Renaissance court. Centuries later, Madame de Pompadour became not only the confidante of Louis XV, but also a patron of Enlightenment thinkers, supporting philosophers and artists whose work transformed French culture. These women demonstrate that the title of mistress obscures their broader impact. They were strategists, cultural patrons, and political operators. Their roles also reveal much about the possibilities and limits of women's power in a society formerly dominated by men. In a system where women could not inherit the throne or hold most public offices, influence had to be exerted through less direct means. The mistress became a channel through which women could gain visibility and impact, but this power was precarious. It depended on the king's favor, and once that waned, enemies moved swiftly to erase their influence. Yet while they held their position, these women often reshaped not only court politics, but also the wider trajectory of the nation. They embodied both the constraints and the possibilities of female authority in early modern Europe. Understanding their influence requires also recognizing the dual nature of court life. On one hand, it was a world of entertainment, fashion, and display. On the other, it was a battlefield where careers, fortunes, and even survival were at stake. The mistress was at the center of both. She was expected to embody beauty, refinement, and wit, serving as a symbol of the king's taste and power. At the same time, she became a player in the ruthless struggles for position and wealth that defined court society. Her salons were not only spaces of leisure, but also hubs of negotiation where factions sought access and influence. The fascination with these women continues today because they illuminate the contradictions of monarchy. The king, presented as an absolute ruler chosen by divine will, was in reality a man influenced by personal relationships and emotions. The mistress represented this tension between ideology and reality. By acknowledging their political roles, we gain a clearer view of how monarchy functioned, not as a solitary figure dictating from above, but as a network of relationships where personal intimacy could translate into public consequence. To reduce them simply to their sexual relationships is to miss the richness of their contributions. They were power brokers who understood the dynamics of the court better than most ministers. They cultivated networks of loyalty, manipulated information, and placed allies in key positions. They also served as patrons of art, architecture, and literature, leaving legacies that shaped French culture for generations. Their presence challenges simplistic distinctions between private and public life, revealing how intertwined the two were in a system where the king's body and desires were inseparable from the state. The world they inhabited was dazzling but dangerous. The gilded rooms of Versailles shimmered with light, yet behind the beauty lay rivalries sharp as daggers. Every word, every glance, every invitation carried political meaning. In such a world, to hold the ear of the king was to command immense power, but also to attract endless enemies. These women navigated this perilous terrain with remarkable skill, and their stories remind us that history is not shaped only by generals and ministers, but also by those who learned to wield influence in less formal, yet equally decisive ways. Their importance is not confined to the past. To study them is to explore enduring questions about power, gender, and representation. How do individuals without formal authority shape decisions? How does intimacy intersect with politics? How are women remembered in history? And how does language such as mistress obscure or diminish their roles? These questions resonate far beyond the French court. They invite us to reconsider the ways we tell stories about power and to look more carefully at those whose influence has been hidden behind dismissive labels. The French court, with all its opulence and ruthlessness, provides a vivid stage on which these dynamics played out. From the Renaissance through the Enlightenment, it was a world where appearances and realities constantly intersected, and where the private life of the monarch was inseparable from the fate of the kingdom. Within that world, the women often dismissed as mere companions of pleasure were, in truth, among the most significant players. Their influence was subtle, complex, and often decisive. To unveil that hidden influence is to see the French court, and indeed the history of monarchy, in a new light. The figures often referred to as royal mistresses in France have long been the subject of fascination, scandal, and dismissal. Yet when we begin to strip away the layers of gossip and stereotype, what emerges is not a string of idle romances, but the portraits of women who became, in many respects, uncrowned queens. They were more than companions in private. They were individuals who could bend the arc of policy, shape the direction of culture, and at times hold the future of entire factions in their hands. To understand them requires seeing the court not as a backdrop of luxury alone, but as a carefully calibrated arena of power where every gesture, every relationship, and every choice carried weight. Within that theater, the women closest to the king could be as vital as any minister or general, though their tools were different and their influence more subtle. Madame de Pompadour is one of the clearest examples of how a woman without a crown could nevertheless act as an architect of politics and culture. Born Jean Antoinette Poisson, she did not come from the highest nobility, which made her rise all the more remarkable. Introduced to Louis XV as a young woman of wit and beauty, she quickly became more than a passing fascination. She understood that the king, weary of endless intrigues and heavy burdens, sought companionship that was not only romantic, but also intellectual and comforting. Pompadour became that figure. She was not content merely to bask in royal favor. Instead, she used her position to support projects that reshaped France. Her patronage of the arts left an imprint that lasted far beyond her lifetime. Under her encouragement, architecture, painting, and decorative arts flourished, blending Rococo elegance with Enlightenment ideas. She was instrumental in supporting the philosopher Voltaire, despite his often controversial writings. In doing so, she linked the monarchy with currents of intellectual change at a time when France was grappling with new ideas about reason, governance, and society. But her reach extended beyond culture. Pompadour involved herself in matters of foreign policy, often serving as a quiet but effective voice in diplomatic discussions. She did not draft treaties herself, but she advised and steered the king, shaping alliances such as the one with Austria. Though this alliance was criticized by many, it demonstrates that her voice could echo in the halls of European power. Pompadour also had to navigate the hostility of courtiers who resented her influence. Ministers, noble families, and rival factions sought to discredit her, painting her as an intruder or manipulator. Yet she held her position for nearly 20 years, a testament to her resilience and political acumen. She cultivated networks of allies, placed supporters in key roles, and mastered the art of presenting herself not only as a lover, but as a confidant indispensable to the king's happiness and stability. By the time of her death, she had left behind a legacy of cultural flourishing and a model of how intimacy and politics could blend into a form of soft power that was as consequential as formal office. Following Pompadour came Madame du Barry, a figure often remembered for scandal rather than substance, yet her story reveals another layer of how uncrowned queens could shape the court. Born Jean Bézieux, she rose from humble beginnings and entered the court through the calculated ambitions of others who saw in her beauty an opportunity for advancement. Introduced to Louis XV later in his reign, she became his favorite at a time when the king's authority was already weakening. Unlike Pompadour, du Barry was not initially seen as an intellectual or a patron of philosophers, but she learned quickly that survival at court required more than charm. Her influence lay in her ability to navigate the treacherous rivalries of Versailles. She became a focal point of resentment for those who despised the idea of a woman of low birth occupying such a privileged place. Yet she also demonstrated a keen instinct for survival, aligning herself with key figures and softening the king's moods when others could not. She was known to intercede on behalf of courtiers, helping them gain access to the king or secure positions. These acts were not merely favors. They were tools for building alliances and ensuring her continued place at court. Her downfall came not during the reign of Louis XV, but after his death, when the court shifted around the young Louis XVI and his consort, Marie Antoinette. The new queen despised du Barry, refusing to speak to her and embodying the disdain of highborn courtiers who saw her as an embarrassment. Stripped of protection, du Barry fell victim to the brutal tides of the French Revolution, eventually executed by the guillotine. Yet her story should not be remembered only for its tragic end. While in favor, she shaped decisions, calmed tensions, and demonstrated how even someone entering court with few advantages could rise to influence through adaptability, charm, and an intuitive sense of power dynamics. Well before either of these women, Another figure set the pattern for how a royal favorite could wield power with subtlety and brilliance. Diane de Poitiers, the companion of Henry II, was decades older than the king when she captured his devotion. Unlike the youthful charmers of later centuries, Diane's strength lay in her maturity, intelligence, and ability to provide steady guidance. She became both his lover and his advisor, shaping his decisions in matters of governance and politics. Her position as a stabilizing force was recognized by contemporaries who saw how Henry relied on her counsel. Diane's influence extended to patronage and symbolism. She encouraged the arts and architecture of the Renaissance court, helping to define the elegance and refinement of the era. She even left her mark on royal iconography, with the crescent moon becoming her emblem, intertwined with the imagery of the monarchy itself. But perhaps most importantly, she demonstrated that influence did not depend on youth or fleeting beauty alone. Her ability to guide the king came from her intelligence, patience, and strategic mind. At a time when the court was filled with shifting alliances, Diane's presence offered continuity, and her role as mentor as much as mistress gave her a stature that rivaled queens. What unites these women, despite their differences in origin, personality, and style, is that they each embodied the paradox of power without title. They could not issue decrees or command armies, yet through their proximity to the king they shaped events in ways that often outlasted them. They were intermediaries between the monarch and the court, between private desire and public consequence. Their influence reminds us that history is not made only by those with crowns on their heads or official offices in their grasp, but also by those who learned how to turn intimacy, intelligence, and adaptability into political tools. The court of France, with all its grandeur, provided the stage for this phenomenon. Every step on its marble floors was watched, every word weighed, every gesture judged. To rise within such an environment required more than luck. It demanded a mastery of performance, charm, and resilience. The so-called mistresses were not anomalies but central figures in this system, filling spaces where women could exert power even when the laws denied them direct authority. By looking beyond the bedchamber, we see that they were uncrowned queens whose influence left traces in diplomacy, culture, and the very fabric of monarchy itself. The world of the French court was built on appearances, yet beneath the surface of ritual and elegance, there were intricate currents of power that often determined the course of politics more effectively than edicts or declarations. To understand the women who occupied the position of royal favorites, one must recognize that their influence did not depend on open displays of authority. Instead, it was rooted in subtle strategies that allowed them to guide decisions, shape relationships, and carve out a place for themselves in a court where visibility was everything and mistakes could be fatal. Their success came not from issuing orders, but from mastering the arts of suggestion, persuasion, and control over the flow of information. They operated in plain sight, yet their true work often remained invisible to those who did not understand how court life functioned. Information was one of their greatest tools. At a time when the king was the center of the state, access to him was coveted by every minister, noble, and petitioner. Gaining that access often depended on those who stood closest to him in daily life. Mistresses became brokers of this access, deciding who could approach the monarch, when and under what circumstances. In an environment where timing was everything, this control gave them immense leverage. A request presented at the right moment could receive royal favor, while one withheld or delayed could doom a career. By acting as gatekeepers, they shaped the flow of influence around the throne, determining whose voices were heard and whose were silenced. This control extended beyond simple introductions. They also shaped the narratives that reached the king. Every monarch was bombarded with opinions, petitions, and reports, many of them contradictory. To navigate this flood of information, the king relied on those he trusted most to filter and interpret what he heard. Mistresses often became these trusted interpreters. They could frame events in a particular light, emphasize one viewpoint over another, or downplay inconvenient facts. This subtle shaping of narrative could alter the king's perception of both domestic and international matters. In a sense, they became editors of reality, deciding what the monarch should see and how he should see it. Beyond information control, their influence depended on their ability to forge alliances. No individual at court, not even the king, functioned in isolation. Power was always contested, and factions rose and fell according to their ability to form connections. Mistresses, aware that their positions were precarious, learned to build networks of loyalty that extended across noble families, ministers, and even foreign diplomats. By supporting the careers of allies, they created bonds of obligation that ensured protection when rivals moved against them. These alliances also gave them leverage in negotiations, since they could call upon a web of supporters to advance or defend their interests. Some alliances were forged through personal charm, others through calculated acts of patronage. A well-timed word to the king could secure a post or title for a supporter, while an introduction at a salon could open doors for an ambitious noble. In this way, mistresses became central nodes in the political network of the court. They were not only companions to the king, but also brokers of relationships that stretched far beyond the walls of Versailles. Even foreign dignitaries recognized their importance. Ambassadors often sought their favor, understanding that gaining their support could ease diplomatic negotiations. This recognition by outsiders demonstrates the extent to which their roles were acknowledged as political even when cloaked in the language of intimacy. Patronage was another powerful weapon in their arsenal. These women had access to wealth, both through the gifts bestowed by the king and the positions they could secure for their allies. They used this wealth not only to display magnificence, which reinforced their status, but also to cultivate loyalty. Supporting artists, writers, and architects allowed them to craft images of themselves as figures of culture and refinement, but it also extended their influence into the broader intellectual and artistic world. A painter or philosopher indebted to a royal favorite could in turn promote her image and defend her reputation. This interplay between wealth, culture, and politics ensured that their influence reached far beyond the immediate circle of courtiers. At the same time, patronage was a form of pressure. By rewarding allies and withholding support from rivals, they shaped the incentives of those around them. Ministers who opposed them risked losing not only royal favor, but also the opportunities for advancement that came through their networks. Conversely, those who aligned with them could see their careers flourish. In a system where social mobility and political success were tied to patronage, the ability of these women to distribute favor made them formidable power brokers. Their influence was not abstract but material, felt in the appointments, titles, and fortunes of those who surrounded them. The strategies they employed were not without risk. Every act of influence invited scrutiny, and rivals were quick to accuse them of manipulation or corruption. The line between guidance and control was thin, and a misstep could provoke backlash. For this reason, subtlety was essential. They could not be seen as openly directing the king, for that would have undermined his authority and exposed them to greater hostility. Instead, they learned to work in ways that allowed the monarch to appear as the ultimate decision-maker, even as their suggestions and framing quietly steered his choices. This delicate balance required constant vigilance and skill. Diane de Poitiers, Madame de Pompadour, and Madame du Barry all illustrate how these strategies played out in practice. Diane, with her maturity and wisdom, became the steady counselor of Henry II, offering advice that was trusted precisely because it seemed measured and discreet. She never appeared to overshadow the king, but her guidance shaped his reign. Madame de Pompadour mastered the art of cultural patronage, creating an image of herself as a refined and enlightened figure, while at the same time forging alliances that supported her role in diplomatic decisions. Madame du Barry, though often dismissed as a mere ornament, used her position to build networks of loyalty and act as a conduit for courtiers seeking the king's attention. Each in her own way demonstrated that power could be exercised most effectively not through overt displays, but through the quiet mastery of courtly mechanisms. The broader lesson from their stories is that political influence often resides not in formal titles, but in the ability to control access, shape narratives, and distribute resources. These women operated in a space officially denied to them, yet by exploiting the structures of court life, they carved out authority that rivaled that of ministers and nobles. Their legacy challenges narrow definitions of power, showing that history is shaped not only by those who sit on thrones or sign decrees, but also by those who influence the minds and emotions of rulers. Their strategies also illuminate the gendered dynamics of the time. In a society that restricted women's direct access to political office, the role of mistress became one of the few avenues through which they could exert influence. Yet within this limitation, they displayed remarkable ingenuity. They transformed roles that were intended to confine them into positions of authority, using the very expectations placed upon them, beauty, charm, companionship, as tools for shaping political reality. This adaptability underscores their significance not only as individuals, but also as symbols of how women navigated and reshaped the structures of early modern power. The brilliance of their subtlety lies in its paradox. Their power was visible to all, and yet denied by official language. They were ridiculed as frivolous, dismissed as distractions, and attacked as corrupting influences, yet courtiers, ministers, and ambassadors all sought their favor because they knew the reality behind the appearance. To study them is to peel back the layers of spectacle that define the French court, and to see how influence functioned in practice. In doing so, we come to appreciate not only the resilience and skill of these uncrowned queens, but also the complexity of monarchy itself, where authority was never the possession of one man alone, but the product of countless relationships, negotiations, and acts of persuasion. Their stories compel us to recognize that politics is as much about perception as it is about policy. By controlling what the king saw, heard, and believed, by building networks of loyalty that extended through court and country, and by using wealth to direct both art and allegiance, they ensured that their voices mattered. They remind us that influence often thrives in the spaces between visibility and invisibility, where suggestion is stronger than command, and where the power to shape outcomes lies in the ability to appear both indispensable and unobtrusive at once. The impact of these uncrowned queens cannot be measured only in their immediate influence over the daily life of the monarch. To fully grasp their place in history, one must look at how their actions, choices, and even their mere presence affected the larger trajectory of France itself. They were woven into the fabric of wars, treaties, royal successions, and cultural transformations. Yet the very same power that gave them extraordinary reach also exposed them to extraordinary danger. Their lives reveal the fragile nature of influence that depends not on formal institutions, but on the shifting sands of favor, perception, and proximity to the throne. Their legacies, though often obscured or belittled by those who sought to reduce them to mere companions, endure in ways that shaped French history long after their deaths. One cannot ignore their role in major historical events. Consider Diane de Poitiers, whose influence on Henry II extended into the realm of foreign policy. Her counsel was not merely domestic, it affected the king's alliances and the kingdom's participation in conflicts. She was not a general, yet her voice could encourage or dissuade action, altering the course of campaigns that touched every corner of Europe. Henry's wars against the Habsburgs, his relationships with powerful noble houses, and his vision of France's position on the continental stage were all influenced by the advice of a woman who held no official title, but whose presence at his side was constant. Centuries later, Madame de Pompadour demonstrated a similar reach. Her role in the diplomatic realignment that became known as the reversal of alliances was pivotal. She supported the Austrian alliance, a controversial choice that contributed to France's involvement in the 7 Years' War. Critics have long blamed her for the defeats that followed, but this oversimplification overlooks the broader context of European rivalry. What matters is that her voice was strong enough to shape a fundamental pivot in French foreign policy. It is impossible to speak of this period of French history without acknowledging that her influence helped to set the course of the kingdom's international role. Madame du Barry's impact, though often understated, also touched matters of consequence. In the waning years of Louis XV's reign, she served as a mediator of tensions at court, softening conflicts and advocating for figures who might otherwise have been excluded. Her support of certain ministers, her intercession on behalf of nobles, and her ability to sway the king's mood gave her a hand in the delicate balance of power within Versailles. Though she did not reshape foreign alliances as Pompadour did, her role in stabilizing the internal politics of the court helped determine which policies advanced and which faltered. Yet this influence was always precarious. It rested on the favor of one man, and favor could change overnight. Diane de Poitiers maintained her position for decades, but only because she skillfully balanced her personal relationship with Henry with the expectations of the nobility and the queen. Her age and wisdom shielded her, but once the king died, her security vanished, and she was forced to surrender the properties and honors she had enjoyed. Her fall was swift, reminding us that influence tied to the monarch's affection could never be permanent. Madame de Pompadour, though she managed to retain the king's trust until her death, was constantly under attack. Pamphleteers mocked her, rivals slandered her, and ministers resented her intervention in affairs of state. She lived with the knowledge that any slip could provide her enemies with the opportunity to destroy her. That she held her position for nearly 2 decades speaks to her resilience, but it also reveals the constant danger of her situation. The very power she wielded made her a target, and she could never entirely silence the chorus of those who questioned her legitimacy. For Madame du Barry, the danger was even greater. After Louis XV's death, she became expendable. The new queen, Marie Antoinette, despised her, and the court that once sought her favor quickly turned its back. During the Revolution, her association with the Ancien regime marked her for death. The same position that had once given her power became the cause of her downfall. She faced the guillotine not because of specific acts of tyranny, but because she embodied the corruption and favoritism the revolutionaries believed they were overthrowing. Her vulnerability was total once the system that had sustained her collapsed. This precariousness underscores the double-edged nature of their influence. They could shape events, yet they could not secure themselves against the instability of the very system in which they thrived. They were indispensable to the monarchs they served, but dispensable to history's harsher judgments. Their vulnerability reveals the paradox of soft power. It can be immense in its effects, yet fragile in its foundations. Despite this fragility, their legacies are enduring. Diane de Poitiers left an imprint on the Renaissance court that outlived her, seen in the architecture she sponsored and the cultural refinement she promoted. Her image, immortalized in portraits, became a symbol of elegance and wisdom. Even stripped of her titles, her influence on Henry's reign remained part of the historical record. Madame de Pompadour's legacy is even more tangible. The artistic and cultural flowering she supported helped define French identity in the 18th century. The decorative style associated with her name, Pompadour taste, shaped fashion, furniture, and design long after she was gone. Her support of Enlightenment thinkers contributed to intellectual currents that would challenge monarchy itself. Even her controversial role in foreign policy forced France to confront its place in a shifting Europe. Though detractors sought to blame her for military defeats, her name endured as one of the most significant figures of her century. Madame du Barry's legacy is more tragic, but no less important. Her rise from humble origins to the pinnacle of Versailles power exposed the contradictions of a court obsessed with birth and hierarchy. Her downfall during the Revolution symbolized the end of an era, the violent rejection of the favoritism and privilege she embodied. In her death, she became a reminder of how the personal politics of the court were inseparable from the fate of the monarchy itself. These women also left a broader legacy in how we understand the role of gender in power. They demonstrated that women, even when excluded from formal authority, could become central actors in the political life of their time. Their actions challenge narrow historical narratives that focus only on kings, ministers, and generals. By recognizing their influence, we gain a fuller picture of how politics functioned in early modern Europe. Their stories complicate the notion of absolute monarchy by showing that the king was never truly alone in his decisions. His companions, confidants, and lovers were part of the machinery of governance, shaping outcomes in ways both direct and subtle. Their legacies also raise questions about how history remembers women in power. The label of mistress has long diminished their contributions, reducing them to figures of scandal or amusement. Yet to see them only through this lens is to repeat the dismissals of their enemies. Their lives were not mere diversions, they were integral to the functioning of the monarchy. Reframing them as political actors allows us to see French history with greater clarity, acknowledging the hidden forces that influenced wars, treaties, successions, and cultural movements. What endures from their stories is not only the details of their influence, but the lesson that power is never confined to official structures alone. It seeps into relationships, flows through networks of trust and loyalty, and often depends on those whose authority is denied in name but undeniable in practice. Diane de Poitiers, Madame de Pompadour, and Madame du Barry stand as reminders that the French monarchy, for all its grandeur, was shaped as much by whispers in private chambers as by proclamations in public halls. In the end, their lives capture the essence of the shifting sands of power. They rose to prominence not through titles or bloodlines, but through intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to turn intimacy into influence. They shaped events of immense historical consequence, yet they lived with constant insecurity, knowing that their position could vanish with a single change of favor. Their legacies remain in the art, the diplomacy, the culture, and the cautionary tales they left behind. To study them is to understand not only the hidden history of the French court, but also the timeless truth that power often resides where it is least expected, and that those who seem marginal may, in fact, shape the destiny of nations. The task of understanding the women who shaped the French court cannot end with their immediate influence, their vulnerability, or even their lasting cultural contributions. To stop there would be to leave their image in the shadows of the very myths and slanders that defined them in their own time. To reclaim their narrative is to strip away the layers of gossip, lampoon, and political propaganda that clouded them during their lives and continued long after their deaths. For centuries, pamphlets, plays, and anecdotes painted them as temptresses, manipulators, or frivolous ornaments of pleasure, while official histories downplayed their significance in order to preserve the image of monarchy as male and divine. Only in more recent years have historians begun to take them seriously as political actors in their own right. Debunking the myths begins with acknowledging the role of propaganda in shaping how these women were remembered. Diane de Poitiers, for instance, was often portrayed as a usurper of the Queen's rightful place, a woman whose control over Henry II was unnatural and excessive. Yet contemporary records reveal her as a skilled manager of estates, a patron of architecture, and a steady counselor whose maturity and experience helped stabilize a young and often impulsive king. Far from a mere seductress, she functioned as an advisor with a practical mind, one who guided the monarchy through turbulent times. Her reputation suffered not because of her incompetence, but because rivals needed to delegitimize her to reclaim influence. Madame de Pompadour was vilified in her lifetime as the root of France's military failures, accused of manipulating Louis XV for personal gain and dragging the kingdom into costly wars. Revolutionary rhetoric later amplified this image, turning her into a symbol of the corruption of the old regime. But modern scholarship paints a more nuanced picture. The foreign policy decisions she influenced were part of broader European dynamics that no single person could control. To blame her for the outcome of the 7 Years' War is to ignore the complexities of global conflict, the rise of Britain as a naval power, and the limitations of French resources. At the same time, her cultural patronage, once dismissed as vanity, is now recognized as a deliberate strategy to align the monarchy with Enlightenment values and artistic innovation. Her salons, far from being spaces of idle gossip, were intellectual arenas where ideas circulated and networks formed. The myth of Pompadour as manipulative distraction collapses when set against the evidence of her active role in both politics and culture. Madame du Barry perhaps suffered most from mythmaking. Her low birth, combined with her position as the king's favorite, made her an easy target for satire. She was caricatured as ignorant, greedy, and unworthy of her elevated position. Revolutionary propaganda went further, turning her into a symbol of decadence whose frivolity epitomized the decay of monarchy. Yet records of her actions reveal a woman who was compassionate, often interceding on behalf of individuals in trouble, and who sought to temper the king's harsher decisions. Her execution during the Revolution was less about her deeds and more about her association with a system that had become intolerable to the people. The myth of du Barry as empty ornament ignores the human being who tried, in her own limited way, to soften the cruelty of a fading regime. Re-examining their lives exposes the biases of historical storytelling itself. Much of the dismissal of these women stems from the patriarchal structures of both their own time and later centuries of historiography. Historians who valued military victories and official decrees often overlooked the influence that came through personal relationships, cultural patronage, and courtly negotiation. Because these forms of power were coded as feminine or domestic, they were diminished. To reclaim the narrative of Diane de Poitiers, Madame de Pompadour, and Madame du Barry is to insist that power exists in many forms, not only in armies or parliaments. It is to recognize that soft power, the power of influence, persuasion, and cultural shaping, was as essential to the survival of monarchy as the signing of treaties or the raising of taxes. This recognition carries lessons that extend far beyond the French court. Power dynamics today continue to operate in ways that are subtle, often hidden, and not always acknowledged in official accounts. Just as mistresses of kings acted as brokers of access, interpreters of information, and builders of alliances, modern figures who may lack formal authority can still wield decisive influence. Advisors, spouses of leaders, donors, or even cultural icons can shift the direction of politics and society without holding office themselves. Their influence often escapes the official record, but shapes outcomes in profound ways. The strategies of subtlety that once governed Versailles, controlling narratives, forging networks, and using cultural capital to exert pressure, are echoed in contemporary forms of lobbying, media influence, and behind-the-scenes negotiation.